Welcome to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast. Each week, we'll be joined by educational experts from across the globe, offering exclusive insights, inspiration, and guidance to help practitioners unlock the potential for learning in the early years. Hello, my name is Ruth Lue-Quee, your host for this week's TTS Talking Early Years podcast. I'm an educational consultant, also known as My Mummy Teacher, founder of MMT Play, and I'm passionate about inclusion and play. Throughout this series, we'll be discussing a range of topics aimed at supporting SEN in the early years, inspiring you with guidance and resources to enhance your practice. I'm delighted to introduce Professor David Daley as today's guest. Welcome to the podcast, David. How are you today?
I'm really well, thank you, Ruth. Thank you for having me back.
It's a pleasure. It was so great to speak to you last time, and I can't wait to crack on with this episode. Just in case anybody hasn't caught up on the last one, could you please give a little quick introduction about yourself?
Hello, everyone. I'm Professor David Daley. I am Professor of Psychological Intervention and Knowledge Exchange and Head of Applied Psychological Practice here at Nottingham Trent University. I am a child psychologist by training and have a lot of experience of working with preschool children.
Fantastic. So in this episode, we're going to be focusing on proactive behaviour strategies. So we're going to think about those small, intentional steps that can really make a big difference in creating a positive learning environment. So hopefully our listeners are going to go away with those little incidental things that they can do that will really, really support their learners, especially with their behaviour. So one of the things that I think is really, really key for any of our children, but especially for our children with special educational needs, is that need to feel safe, that need to feel secure. And one of the ways to make sure we can do that is through predictability, is through having our routines, having things that are clear, our visual schedules for our pupils. What would you say, how important are these? And what sorts of things can practitioners put in place to support their learners?
So having a predictable environment is key for everyone, to be honest. So if your environment isn't predictable, whether you're in an early years or you're a 52-year-old university professor, if you don't have a predictable environment, then there is uncertainty. And when there's uncertainty, there's often anticipation about what might come. And that anticipation often drives anxiety. And so a lot of what we see in the early years environment around undesirable behaviour is in part driven by low levels of anxiety or uncertainty, because the child just doesn't know what is coming next, and they may not know what is coming next for a variety of reasons. They may have forgotten. They may not have paid attention in the first place when the teacher announced what it is that was coming next. They may know what's coming next, but they may not know how they're going to experience it. So the anxiety of it may dominate. So if it's something, it's quite often like a change in routine. The class are going out into the playground for PE, the class are going into the assembly hall for assembly or something else. That's a change in the routine, and it creates uncertainty and it creates anxiety. So we really want early years practitioners who have looked at last week's episode to be curious about children who might be more vulnerable to that uncertainty and anxiety, and to realize that small changes in the classroom environment can help those children to better regulate that uncertainty and anxiety. So for children who don't remember or who have struggled to pay attention, and let's be honest, even without being at risk of ADHD, that's still quite a lot of children in the early years environment, then you may want to recruit their attention. So particularly for children who are quite forgetful or don't pay attention, if the early years practitioner knows that it's 5 or 10 minutes before PE, and they're already thinking, it takes 10 minutes for all the children to get changed into their PE kit because just with young children, it takes forever. Now's the time I need to be reminding some of them. So you might identify those particular children, might recruit their attention and say, it's PE next. We're going to be getting ready for PE in 5 minutes. For children who may be more at risk of actual ADHD, they also have very poor understanding of time. So it's great to tell them that it's going to be PE in 5 minutes, but 5 minutes to them has no actual meaning. So for those children, you could also pair it with the sand timer. If you have a sand timer in the classroom, for that one child who really struggles, you say, it's going to be PE in 5 minutes. And you give them the sand timer and you say, we'll get ready for PE when all the sand is at the bottom. And now the child has a visual cue for when PE is going to happen. In general, it's really helpful for all children if there is predictability. So it's really useful for there to be a visual representation of what the day is going to be like. English early years providers are actually quite regulated. There's lots of things they need to do. So there is usually a very predictable pattern to, we're going to do some literacy, we're going to do some numeracy, there's going to be some art. So there is, and it's all, the children don't realize it, but it's all very carefully planned. What often isn't the case is that it's not always obvious to the children. So having a little kind of visual diary, maybe that comes up on the interactive whiteboard several times during the day, just reminding children what comes next so that there isn't a surprise, or it might be something that they enjoy much more. So say it's going to be art, and at the moment you're doing literacy and some children are struggling, but it may help them to concentrate and work at it for a bit longer because they know the next thing is coming is going to be something that they really enjoy. It's PE or it's art or it's something else, or it's even break time. And it's really important for those children to know that I might be really struggling and I'm finding this a bit boring and I'm not finding it very interesting, but soon I get to go outside and I get to run around with my friends. So it allows them to engage and tolerate for a little bit longer.
Yeah, absolutely. I think they're really, really great things that we can put into place. And just by adding in the sand timer and having that physical visual for the child, it makes such a big impact on those children that need it. And one of the other things that I think is really important that we sort of haven't spoke about is the predictability of an adult. So whichever adults are within that setting, making sure that they are dependably boring. For want of a better word, you're going to turn up every single day, you're going to be the same because you're consistent and you're predictable, and that child knows that you've got their back and you're always going to have their back, and you're going to push them on in ways and you're going to support them in ways, but that predictability is there within that relationship as well, and building that is really, really key in supporting our children with special needs, and of course all our children as well, again, to reduce that anxiety. When we've got particular individuals that do need more intervention or they need more support with their behaviour, what sorts of individual strategies would you put into place, perhaps for children that are struggling on a support plan? What sort of things would you be saying is perhaps more than just a reasonable adjustment like a sand timer? What are the next steps, sorts of things you'd recommend for supporting behaviour?
So it really does depend on what the child's difficulties are like. In the early years setting, a lot of the needs that children seem to have do center around ADHD-like type difficulties. I'm not necessarily saying all those children will go on and get a diagnosis, or autistic-like difficulties. So I think it's worth spending a little bit of time on those particular challenges for the early years practitioners. So for children who may be more at risk of ADHD type difficulties, and honestly in the early years practitioner, even though the prevalence of ADHD in the general population is about 5%, it can be 15 or 20% of children in early years who seem to be a bit more at risk. Mm-hmm. And then developmentally, by the time they get into key stage 1, some of them have calmed down and they seem to be managing, and others are still at risk. So for those children, a number of very reasonable adjustments are warranted. So for children who struggle to sit in a chair, then a resistance band is a really good idea. So a resistance band is just a little, like a giant latex rubber band, and it goes around the 2 of the legs of the chair, and the child can use their feet to push it, so they can fidget with their feet. And we know that individuals with ADHD type difficulties, they need to fidget in order to be able to concentrate. And so there are two real advantages to the resistance band. First of all, it allows you to fidget with your feet so that your hands are free to do the things that are needed. So you can write and you can turn over pages and use worksheets. So that's the advantage of resistance bands over lots of more general fidget tools. The second and most important feature of a resistance band in an early years practitioner is that it has zero abuse potential. There are lots of fidget tools that can become missiles, and there are lots of children with ADHD type difficulties in the early years who have lots of emotion regulation challenges as well. So the resistance band is quite safe. You literally can't throw it. Yes, if you try very hard, then you could zap somebody with it in the way that adolescents might use a wet towel after PE to zap somebody else. But that's really the only way in which it could be misused. So they're very cheap, they're very effective, and they're not likely to cause any other problems. The other reasonable adjustment for children with attentional difficulties is about where you place them in the classroom. So there is always a tendency for SEND children to place them at the front by your desk where you can keep a beady eye on them. But they're often quite annoying. Lovely, but quite annoying. And so I would always encourage you to place the more ADHD type children towards the back of the classroom, because they do get up and down a lot more. And if they're up and down out of their seat a bit more and they're towards the back, then they're not disrupting the rest of the class. So it's easier for them to do it. But also you as a teacher are less impacted by their behavior. You obviously still need to take responsibility for circling around the class and making sure that they're on task. But every early years practitioner is doing that anyway. There's nobody in early years just sitting at the front and doing whole class activity all of the time. So it's a strategy that works very well. And the third thing that really works well is giving the child permission to get up and down for lots of reasons without having to ask permission. So it's almost like attentional breaks so that they can move around the classroom legitimately. And so it's fine to say you can go to the toilet without asking permission, you can go and get a drink without permission, you can go to your tray without permission, you can sharpen a pencil without permission. And they will do that a lot just because they need breaks, but they're doing it in a way that doesn't draw any attention to them. And it's almost giving them permission to regulate their own concentration by having reasons that they can go. And they'll go to the toilet 10 or 12 times. And we quite often find parents are taking their young children to pediatricians and they're getting kidney checks because they're convinced there's something wrong with their kidneys. But actually there's not. They're not going to the toilet because they need to go to the toilet. They're going to the toilet because it's one of the things that they're allowed to do, and they're desperate to just get up and move around. Mm-hmm. For autistic type children, a lot of it is about providing more sensory needs in a more appropriate way. So it would be partially also thinking about where you might place that child. So a lot of classrooms don't have blinds, so you may want to move them away from the window so that they're not suddenly blinded by when the sun decides to come out from behind the clouds. Maybe move them away from a radiator so they're not really close to some intense heat. But also think about how you can provide access to more things that will provide them with sensory feedback. And again, we're down here to kind of sensory tools. So can you give them, some blue tack or a stress ball so they can squish it to get some sensory feedback? We quite often encourage parents to sew into the pocket of a skirt or a school trousers a piece of fluffy material. And so the young child can just discreetly put their hand in their pocket and they can just stroke some very fluffy piece of material and they can get their sensory feedback. And if you don't do that, you just find that the child will go and find something that is sensory and they will stroke it. So they'll end up doing inappropriate things like stroking another child's backpack because it's got something sensory, or stroking the teacher's cushion because it's nice and fluffy. And so we really want to make sure in the early years setting that we are doing little interventions that allow children to begin to manage their own behavior, but to do it in a discreet way so that there's no stigma and that they don't stand out.
Yeah, absolutely. Some really good tips there. And the biggest thing that I picked up on there is that need for movement. Now, within the early years, we are best placed to be getting our children to move as much as we possibly can. So I think one of the biggest takeaways there is to do that, to allow our children as much movement and as much play as we possibly can throughout their day, because it's going to absolutely really support them to thrive within our settings as well. Thank you ever so much for joining me today. That has been an absolutely wonderful episode to have again.
A pleasure. Thank you.
I'd like to say a huge thank you to our guest, David, for joining us and providing such valuable insights. You've been listening to the TTS Talking Early Years podcast with me, Ruth Lue-Quee, and Professor David Daley. If you've been inspired by our conversation today, don't forget you can sign up via the link in our episode notes to be the first to hear about future episodes and access exclusive follow-up content, including ideas for your settings and links to relevant resources.